going to move on to our next session with Dr. Adam Friedman. Dr. Adam Friedman is professor and interim chair of dermatology and running the residency program. He's also director of translational research and director of supportive oncodermatology in the Oncodermatology Clinic in the Department of Dermatology at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences in Washington, D.C. Adam, thank you so much for being here. As I'm stumbling through your multitude of titles, thank you so much for your expertise. Yeah, not exactly, but thank you so much for being here, and we appreciate you talking to us this evening about what we should know about the therapies, of which there are innumerable therapies that are being studied right now for COVID-19.
Yeah, no, you said it, and thank you, Brad, for first, inviting me, but assembling this motley crew of experts. Also want to give you a huge thanks for giving me such a complex and fluid topic. Full disclosure, I am by no means an expert in the treatments for COVID-19, but I guess the good news to that point is that no one is, because this is constantly changing. And so I guess in the land of the blind, the one-eye man is king, and I guess I have a part of an eye formed. So my purpose tonight is not to teach you how to use the various therapies that are being investigated, but just so you can keep in the know. Our patients are constantly sending us in questions. You heard from Dr. Council the many ways our patients can still get in touch with us. And one of the nice things is we can actually bill for those back and forth, so long as you obviously get permission from the patient, consent that this is going to be a billable service. But patients are using every way possible to get in touch with us. And part of that's going to be asking us about the therapies that are constantly spoken about in the literature and, of course, the media. So there are three general approaches. Granted, some of these therapies kind of overlap with one another. But there's antivirals, which we'll start with, immunotherapies, and this kind of goes into what Joel was alluding to with respect to a possible protective effect for immunomodulating or immunosuppressing therapies. And then I'll briefly touch on vaccines or vaccine-like approaches. The NIH just recently came out with evidence-based treatment guidelines that are available at this website. Spoiler alert, there aren't any really, as every guideline says there's not enough evidence to support anything. I think the benefit of this website and this compilation is there are some recommendations against in terms of certain combinations of therapies, which we'll talk about, that they say should not be used because of potential risk, and that risk is not outweighed by any known benefit. So I think we can all agree uniformly that this is not the right way to treat COVID-19. And sadly, there are actually some reports from poison control of people ingesting various anti-sanitizers. So I hope that across the board we agree this is not the way to do it, and that we can offer proper advice to our patients not to utilize this approach. All right, so let's get into antivirals. So when I made this presentation, and granted, I had to update it yesterday because once again, there are constant updates to the armament. There were 14 antivirals in development. I'd argue there are probably more now. And I'm only going to really focus on two. One that's had some supportive evidence and is apparently becoming the standard of care, and one that has been kind of pushed to the side. So unless you've been hiding under a rock, Remdesivir has been getting a lot of attention, especially in the last couple days. This is a broad spectrum antiviral agent. It's been around actually for quite some time. It was actually developed initially, I believe, for SARS and various other viral respiratory infections, but it received a lot of attention with its use for COVID-19 infection. Most of the data available is non-peer reviewed, and that makes sense. We're trying to get this information out there as quickly as humanly possible. So a lot of the studies that are emerging really don't have the rigor of peer review. But I think the majority of the evidence is certainly supportive, but it does go back and forth. Depending on the day, you may see a press release saying that several studies from China, multi-center study from China showed mixed results versus a study in the US showing positive results. I think one of the problems is it all depends on your inclusion criteria. It always goes down to who are you studying, and depending on how severe the patient is when you actually get to them, that certainly can play a big role in those outcomes. But I include some of the studies that have been published, all of them in very high-level journals, in the Journal of Medicine, The Lancet. But as I mentioned, many of these are not peer-reviewed. Now, just yesterday, there was some breaking news. there was a published results from a U.S. study, actually right on the coattails of a Chinese study that showed there were mixed results, but the U.S. study actually was very promising. And what it showed was that 5-day treatment was analogous to 10-day treatment with respect to overall efficacy. And I'll show you that in a moment. This is funny because once again, that kind of back and forth, even earlier, just last week, there was some negative press that the WHO released some negative results. So, it's very possible I may say all these wonderful things that, Tony Fauci gets on stage and says, this is now the standard of care, and tomorrow it could not be the standard of care. But as of right now, that is certainly where we're headed. This is one of the examples where the NIH consortium feels very strongly that we are not going to use this. So this is a combo protease inhibitor for HIV. The data available, the clinical trial data available, was really not supportive, did not show any real benefit. So I think for the time being, we're really going to be looking at Remdesivir and the data and utilizing it in the hospital setting. And once again, it sounds like the 5-day dosing has the same outcomes as the 10-day dosing, and they were looking at death as an endpoint as well as discharge from the hospital, which there's a high percentage of those who received the medication. All right, let's get on to immunotherapies. I think this is probably where we are going to have the strongest impact. And as dermatologists, we can have a lot of input here because manipulation of the immune system is our bread and butter. And the reason why I think, and once again, Joel kind of started to hit upon this, the reason why this viral infection is so impactful and is killing people left and right is not the infection itself and what it's doing. It's rather the immune response, as well as how the virus uncouples the very close relationship between two key important proteins, ACE and ACE2, which in addition to being part of the renin-angiotensin system, are integrally involved in immunoregulation. And so when you think about that psoriasis patient who already has a predilection for inappropriate inflammation, what we can almost lean towards an autoinflammatory state, I certainly worry that this virus can push them even over the top into this rapidly, evolving and progressive cytokine storm, which is what's actually killing people. So there are a couple of drugs under investigation, most of which already have approval for other indications. The first is Tolucizumab. This is a monoclonal antibody against IL-6 receptor, and it actually is approved for a very similar clinical picture, which is seen when patients are treated with CAR T cell therapy, creating CRS, which is pretty much the cancer drug version of cytokine storm associated with COVID-19. This drug is approved for many different indications, which is nice because we already have some experience with it, especially rheumatology has experience with this drug. So we already have a decent amount of safety information. There is some positive data out there, but once again, non-peer reviewed, more experience. But I imagine that we're going to see some emerging data using this monoclonal antibody. There's a sister monoclonal antibody to the same receptor. This one only has the RA indication. The one interesting bit of information that I will share, and this was not for COVID-19, but there was a head-to-head study comparing Seralutinib to the other IL-6 receptor inhibitor, and the data was equivalent. So they seemed to work the same, had the same efficacy, same safety profile for RA. So maybe there could be an opportunity to get access to either one for the study and possibly management of cytokine storm associated with COVID-19.
Adam,
Anakinra.
Adam, are these agents, the interleukin-6 agents, are they mainly being used in the patients that are vented, that are severely ill?
Yes, as of right now, correct. So these are patients who are circling the drain. In an ideal world, we would block that that circling, that whirlpool-like degradation before it gets to the endpoint. So that's where I think we have to be very careful how we evaluate the data. If someone is already in DIC, I don't think giving them one of these therapies is going to be that helpful. They're already throwing clots and bleeding out everywhere. So I think certainly identifying these patients early, and no question, there's emerging evidence that the skin could be a potential way to identify patients with infection, though we're not there yet. Certainly engaging these patients early to both mitigate and even possibly prevent this downstream cytokine storm is going to be the utmost importance. But yeah, as of right now, it's being studied in more advanced patients. So Anakinra, we should all be familiar with, is IL-1 receptor antagonist, used for various autoinflammatory diseases, cryopyrin, complement cascade pathway, inherited diseases. It is used also off-label for severe CAR T cell mediated CRS. Which, similar to the first biologic I mentioned, is actually a proven indication. So, there isn't really any data. They're exploring it, but just something to think about off-label. And of course, as Brad alluded to, if you're really in a crisis, certainly something you can think about. JAK inhibitors were mentioned earlier. So I'm just bringing up one that was a small study or information published in The Lancet really trying to support the utilization of JAK inhibitors. There is even some evidence that possibly through JAK inhibition, you can inhibit how the virus actually enters cells. So it's not just kind of really muting the immune response, but actually could prevent invasion as well. But granted, a lot of this is more in vitro and theoretical at this point. But as you heard, there are ongoing studies to try and better elucidate the potential role for oral JAK inhibitors. I think it's important to talk about antimalarials because I think that got the most coverage and press, and there's been a lot of confusion and also I think some unfortunate impact, especially on dermatology. I gotta say, full disclosure, and there's no conflict of interest, I love antimalarials. I love hydroxychloroquine. We could use it for so many things, and it works really, really well, and it's pretty safe in the scheme of things. It's been around for a long time, which gives us a lot of credibility when we're talking about that safety profile. In terms of MOA, it does a lot, and there's probably a lot more we don't understand, but it has a lot of anti-inflammatory properties, and that's probably where it could, if it will ever make its mark for COVID-19, it will make its mark. Though I will tell you there is some in vitro data that chloroquine has some antiviral properties, but I think truthfully, if it's going to do anything, it's going to be through its mitigation of the inflammatory cascade. Beyond there, we use it for a lot of things. I mean, I love it for more photosensitive diseases, even beyond lupus. I use it for photo-induced urticaria, solar urticaria, probably almost every connective tissue disease, though no question with dermatomyositis, there could be a paradoxical worsening, but I still will use it in that setting. So lots of potential there. I love this title of this paper, Why All SLE Patients Should Be Given Hydroxychloroquine, and I agree with this. Now, why I am harping on this is because our SLE patients and even our CLE patients, they are suffering not only because of shortages, but because pharmacists are being told to only dispense small amounts of hydroxychloroquine. I had to very nicely, in my super adult voice just the other day, talk to a pharmacist who was refusing to give my DLE patient, and severe DLE patient at that, more than 20 pills just once a day of hydroxychloroquine with no refills. And I had to explain what disease state we were treating, why this is first-line therapy. I was able to overturn that decision. But I imagine many of you tuning in are facing that issue as well. As I mentioned, we use it for a lot of things, and this is not even the complete list, but certainly a lot of utility for chronic inflammatory diseases. So going to COVID-19, the reality is, to date, there is not enough evidence to support its use. Even more importantly, what was initially suggested was the combo of azithromycin as well as hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine. That combination can actually increase QT prolongation, and so could cause very deadly arrhythmias. So the NIH or the NIH guidelines I mentioned, they're suggesting not utilizing that. And actually, for hydroxychloroquine, we should only be using in the setting of the clinical trials. I actually remember seeing an email from one of the New York hospitals where they were, part of their protocol was to put every single patient who was COVID positive on hydroxychloroquine. That has since changed because of the data that has emerged that has really not been that supportive of its use for treatment. Nitric oxide. This is an incredible, very simple biomolecule. We're all making it right now for all these different purposes and more. The limitation of utilizing nitric oxide in the clinical space is that it's very labile, very short-lived, and its delivery and generation is very difficult. There is an FDA-approved gaseous tank that is available for the treatment of pulmonary hypertension, and we'll talk a little about that in a moment. So nitric oxide is produced in our body by 3 different enzymes. However, while they all have the same name, they are expressed in different locations. For example, NOS1 is expressed in the central nervous system and peripheral nerves, whereas NOS3, or endothelial nitric oxide synthase, is expressed in the endothelium. And NOS2, which is usually the cause of problems when it comes to nitric oxide, is expressed on immune cells. And this is the sucker that churns out tons of nitric oxide to literally kill everything. So why do you need to know about this? So I think there's tremendous potential given the multifaceted biological activity of nitric oxide. It is broad spectrum antimicrobial. Our macrophages make nitric oxide to kill literally everything. It does it through direct cidal effects, but also nitric oxide intermediates like peroxynitrite are also antimicrobial. As I mentioned, the endothelial cells can actually make nitric oxide. And it's actually really, really important that those cells are not disturbed and that they are able to make that very low level nitric oxide to maintain vascular stability. Now, when that endothelium is damaged, like, I don't know, when COVID-19 enters those cells through ACE2 and damages ACE2, that's when you start to get vascular dysfunction. That's where you get leaky vessels. That's where you get perivascular inflammation, and probably one of the reasons why we're seeing what are now called COVID toes, this perniosis-like appearance. So the nitric oxide is central to maintaining that vascular tone, as well as nitric oxide is important in maintaining a balanced immune system. When it goes in overdrive, that's when we see ARDS or ARDS. So I think there's a lot of potential here. I mentioned a moment ago that really it's involved in every process here. And so if you think about the kind of downward spiral or cascade that's happening with COVID infection, and granted, this is somewhat rudimentary, nitric oxide could possibly block every single element of this. The limitation is how are we going to deliver it in a meaningful way? We do have some data with respect to the use of the INO. This is the gaseous tank of nitric oxide. You may have seen in the media, there are several major academic institutions that are studying inhalable nitric oxide. The protocols are pretty robust and it's pretty expensive, but thus far the data has been very promising. I think what it comes down to, though, is coming up with a more feasible way to deliver nitric oxide over time. Full disclosure, this is something I'm working on, so stay tuned for that. Moving on to vaccines, I'm not going to spend really much time on that. Just to mention, there are many vaccines in development. Most are exploratory, but there are several in phase 1 studies looking at toxicity. But overall, I'm not sure how much this is going to do. I think there's a lot of promise here, but we really don't even know the full behavior of this virus and how it behaves. How even having antibodies, does that confer protection? Can this reactivate like hepatitis? I think only time will certainly tell. As I mentioned, there's one that has entered human testing as of March 16th. There is a list that's constantly updated, provided by the WHO, so I recommend checking that out if this is something you're interested in. Last but not least, convalescent plasma. So pretty much the idea here is simple. You're donating intravenous immunoglobulins from patients who have gone through it to patients who are currently experiencing it. Some supportive data published in JAMA, but still in its infancy with respect to understanding its efficacy. So I know that was a mind-melting, face-blasting overview of what's going on in this space. I guarantee you it's going to change, and probably a lot of stuff I even mentioned today is going to be outdated by tomorrow. So I implore you all to keep in touch with, have your finger on the pulse of what's going on. Utilize those links because they are constantly updated in terms of what's the greatest and latest. Thanks for your attention.